Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that is, well, often profoundly misunderstood: severe mental illness. But we're not looking at it from a clinical textbook point of view. Instead, we're stepping right into the lived reality of a major manic and psychotic episode, looking through the eyes of author Andrew Turtle. We'll be drawing directly from his deeply personal reflections as he looks back on his recovery. You see, severe psychosis is usually viewed from the outside looking in. But what does it actually feel like from the inside? How does a person bridge that massive gap between a broken reality and their own recovery? Let's find out together. Imagine just for a second believing that you're broadcasting your ideas to the entire world. And the wildest part? To you, it makes perfect, absolute sense. That was Andrew's reality back in 2023. His mind was just overflowing with ideas. He was having visions that felt nothing short of extraordinary. He describes this state where thoughts just rolled effortlessly off his tongue, and he truly believed he literally held the answers to the world's problems. It's the ultimate paradox of the manic mind, right? A state of absolute, undeniable certainty right in the middle of complete unreality. Section 1. The Whirlwind of Mania. So, that thrilling, overflowing feeling of having all the answers? That was really only one side of the coin. Andrew describes his 2023 major manic and psychotic episode exactly like a whirlwind: fast, intense, and completely all-consuming. There's this sheer jarring contrast between his delusion and his reality. Internally, he believed he was drafting this epic email to Elon Musk to fundamentally transform humanity's resources. It felt grand. It felt vital. But in reality, he was spending extraordinary amounts of money, smashing his phone in a fit of anger, and terrifyingly, jumping out of his mother's moving car. These actions were incredibly dangerous, yet internally, he felt like a global savior. And this massive disconnect spilled right out into the public sphere. His delusion convinced him he was effortlessly solving the world's problems. Meanwhile, reality saw Andrew walking barefoot and shirtless through town, just going up to strangers to tell them he had the solutions to all their problems. He was having strange conversations with close friends that totally crossed normal social boundaries. He was even being followed down the street by police who were genuinely concerned for his safety. He was entirely outside the bounds of normal society. Andrew perfectly summarizes this whole complex situation, saying, "The remarkable thing is that none of this seemed unusual to me at the time." Let's just pause and truly empathize with that for a second. Despite the police following him, despite jumping from a moving car, despite walking shoeless through town, he never once stopped to think something might be wrong. Everything felt completely normal to him. The illness essentially masks itself, convincing the person that they are the only one who truly sees reality clearly. Section 2. Friction in the hospital. So what happens when an unstoppable internal delusion meets an immovable external system? The transition from the street to a clinical environment, specifically facing involuntary treatment, is incredibly jarring. Looking back, Andrew notes that passing through those hospital doors did not magically cure his mania, far from it. When he arrived, he still firmly believed his behavior made perfect sense. He was completely out of control. He's singing to the hospital security guards. He's offering up this bizarre advice to people on how to predict human behavior. He was acting in ways that were clearly inappropriate for a hospital. But remember, he was still operating under the assumption that he was the most rational person in the room. And here's why his behavior was so out of sync with the hospital environment. In his mind, he wasn't a patient being admitted to a psych ward. No way. He was living out this massive biblical delusion. He believed he was actively experiencing the 7 days of creation. So while doctors and nurses were running clinical assessments, Andrew was navigating a completely different universe, this grand, divine narrative that layered itself right over the sterile hospital walls. Section 3. The Turning Point. But a delusion of that magnitude can only withstand the friction of reality for so long. Eventually, inside the high dependency unit, the walls of that grand illusion finally began to show their cracks. Reflecting on this pivotal moment, Andrew noted, "The reality around me no longer fit the narrative I was trying to maintain." That is such a powerful way to describe it. It wasn't that someone simply convinced him he was wrong. It was that the story he built in his head, that whole 7 days of creation narrative, just couldn't bend enough to explain the clinical, restrictive reality of the locked unit. The puzzle pieces just stopped fitting together. This grand illusion unraveled in very distinct steps. First, while actively fighting for what he perceived to be his rights in the unit, something just wasn't adding up. The overarching story stopped making sense, and that led to the next step. For the very first time since the whirlwind began, Andrew actually began to question what was happening. Reality didn't just snap back instantly like a rubber band. Instead, the delusion simply exhausted its ability to explain his surroundings. Section 4. Awakening and Recovery. Once the delusion breaks, you are left with the daunting task of figuring out who you actually are. His realization wasn't some sudden flash of lightning. It was a gradual awakening, mapped across different environments. It started with questioning the delusion in the high-dependence unit. Then, as he transitioned to the general psychiatric ward, it shifted into deep reflection. Finally, moving to the Hills Clinic, it transformed into active documentation and writing. The physical map of his recovery literally mirrored his mind, slowly piecing itself back together. What's truly profound here is what real recovery actually looks like. Once the delusion faded, Andrew didn't try to justify it. Instead, he turned entirely inward. He started trying to understand himself. He reflected on his work experiences, his interpersonal relationships, and his childhood. He allowed past traumas to surface. He realized that to heal the mind, he had to take a hard look at the actual life events that had shaped it. And how did he anchor himself during this massive internal excavation? With this visceral, incredibly striking action, gathering actual scraps of paper in the hospital to document reality. Just picture that for a second. He goes from a state where he thought he was emailing Elon Musk and broadcasting to the world, all the way down to holding on to literal scraps of paper just to write down what was happening around him in the room. It was a humble, grounding exercise that rooted him firmly back in the real world. Gradually, those scraps of paper evolved into something much, much larger. What started as just documenting hospital life became a massive project of self-discovery. By the time his recovery process continued at the Hills Clinic, he was deeply immersed in writing, and that writing turned into two distinct works, a book called The Dialectics and Mania, and his personal memoir, A Turtle's Journey. He used writing not just as a way to record his trauma, but as the primary tool to actively make sense of it. At the very core of Andrew's story is this profound realization. What followed was a different journey. Not one of delusion, but one of understanding. This brilliantly reframes how we should view mental health recovery. The end of a psychotic episode isn't just the cessation of illness. It's the beginning of deep, profound self-understanding. It's replacing the false narratives of mania with the truthful, and sometimes painful, narratives of one's actual lived experience. So I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. How does hearing the patient's story firsthand change the way we view mental health treatment? Andrew's reflections remind us that beneath all the clinical symptoms, the inappropriate behavior, and the involuntary holds, there is a real human being desperately trying to make their reality make sense. By bringing lived experiences like his into mainstream discussions, we don't just understand the illness better, we understand the person. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope it sparked a new perspective for you today.